my name is Trisha Perry. In terms of this morning's program, we are going to be talking about essentially sexual harassment in the workplace. And so that is essentially the, sorry, I'm just making sure my slides here move. Here we go. So that is our program this morning. So I want to talk to you a little bit about this program. I've been involved since the development of the program started back in 2019, pre-pandemic times. It seems like so long ago now. But essentially, the Public Legal Education Service of New Brunswick and the New Brunswick Human Rights Commission have partnered together to create this program. So if you don't know a lot about these organizations, PLEIS NB is a not-for-profit charitable organization whose mandate it is to promote access to the justice system in New Brunswick and throughout Canada, frankly, by developing plain language, bilingual, educational, and informational resources and services about the law. And the New Brunswick Human Rights Commission, which is established by legislation back in 1967, provides citizens of New Brunswick with an effective way of addressing complaints of discrimination. Their mandate includes educating the public about this process and maintaining ongoing awareness of the effects of inequality and diversity and inclusivity in New Brunswick. So these two organizations partnered together, as I said, beginning in and around 2019. And the goal was really to implement a project on addressing and preventing workplace sexual harassment. And although the tools and resources developed as part of this project are meant to aid all employers and employees in New Brunswick, the project does have a particular focus on vulnerable peoples, including members of the LGBTQ2S+ communities and populations. And part of the reason why the project has been focused on these vulnerable communities is based on research that has confirmed current sexual harassment legislation, policies, remedies have historically been locked in essentially reductive, socially constructed gender binary classifications like he, she, him, her. And that restrictive approach to how we talk about and educate about workplace sexual harassment has left a lot of folks to the sidelines of the discourse. And so for one of that, for that reason, the project has this particular focus. One important resource that's been developed as part of this project is a workplace learning program and accompanying tools and resources for employers and employees. And so that's what you're participating in this morning. So just a little bit about me before we dive into the details of the program. So as I said, my name is Trisha Perry. I am a lawyer by trade. I practiced privately here in New Brunswick for about 15 years. And my focus while I was in practice was labor and employment and administrative law. And so that part of my career had a significant focus on workplace issues, including workplace harassment. Sexual harassment is a form of which. And so the majority of my career has been specialized essentially around dealing with workplace issues of this nature. A few years ago, I co-founded a company called Resonance. And at Resonance, we are essentially a boutique workplace services firm. And so our services include helping organizations provide safer workplaces and more productive workplaces. So we do a lot of work here around governance, conflict resolution, investigations, but a big piece of what we also do is workplace training. So I was asked by PLEIS NB and the New Brunswick Human Rights Commission to facilitate today's session, in part because I have that historical background and in part because I helped create the training material. So in terms of housekeeping, this is generally a 3-hour session. Today will likely be shorter than that because we are giving today's session as a webinar as opposed to an interactive session. The time frame you can expect to probably be shorter than the 3-hour normal benchmark. We will take a 10-minute break around the end of part 3 of our program this morning. So some just best practices for participants. It is helpful if you have obviously other apps and distractions closed. Normally, we would ask you to use your video, and as I understand it as part of this webinar, that's not really an option, but we will have some ability to interact, and in a minute, Matt's going to explain that to you. So in terms of handouts, there should be, you should have been provided a link to what's called the Safer Spaces NB website. And in that website is a number of resource materials that I'm going to be referencing today. And Matt, maybe if you wouldn't mind just popping that link to the website in the chat. And then Matt, if you would, perhaps you could explain to the participants how they might be able to participate with us today in this webinar format.
Absolutely. Thank you, Trisha. Good morning, everyone. So as Trisha said, my name is Matt Smith, and I'm a third-year law student at the University of New Brunswick, and I'm a volunteer here at PLEIS MB. I was a legal researcher over the summer. And before that, I worked for 10 years at AIDS New Brunswick Incorporated, where I was also the executive director. So I worked a lot in sexual health, and I'm really excited to be able to take my knowledge from initial with sexual health, moving into sort of this new but also somewhat familiar area. So I have just popped the link for the Safer Places MB resources into the chat there for everyone to see. If anyone has any problems with that, please let me know. Like Trisha said, we normally administer this workshop as more of a meeting rather than a webinar, but because we have 55 participants today, which is much, much larger than we normally do, we did opt to go for the webinar format. So you will see some things that pop up on your screen that might direct you to do something that is not a feature of the webinar. So just bear with us as we adjust for that. So today's webinar will be provided in English. However, we have arranged for simultaneous translation into French. So at the bottom of your screen, you will see a little globe icon where you can select the language of your choice. Because you can also mute the original speaker if you like. So if we're using the webinar function for Zoom today, as I had mentioned, this means you are all automatically muted and your cameras are turned off. And we are recording today's webinar. We are recording today's webinar up until the Q&A portion, and therefore we will reserve all questions. We'll get you to reserve all your verbal questions until the end of the presentation. If you have any questions due to technical difficulties, if you just want to pop them into the chat feature, we are monitoring that. And you'll find that button at the bottom of your screen. And it is only visible to us, the host, so someone will try to help you out. If you have questions for the presenters, I'll be monitoring that. And you can type your question into the Q&A function at the bottom of Zoom, right on the bottom screen there.
Great, thanks very much, Matt. So I will just encourage folks to, if you have questions at any time, as Matt said, you can use the Q&A function. We will monitor that throughout the program. And ultimately, I'm happy at any time to stop and answer any questions. And so please don't feel like you need to sort of wait to the end of the program to do that. So I will just say that the Safer Places NB website, Matt has popped that link into the chat. I want to highlight for you, though, if you haven't already visited the website, some of the great resource material that you can find there. So there's a plethora of material, but essentially recall that the purpose of this project or program was to develop training resources and tools for employers and employees around this issue of workplace sexual harassment. So in there, you will find all kinds of material that will be helpful for you, either as an employee or as an employer responsible for others in the workplace. So that includes things like a template complaint form that organizations can use in the event they have an internal complaint of workplace harassment. There are some handouts around taking action if you are a bystander to workplace sexual harassment, taking action if you are the target of that behavior. There are some definition documents on the website with respect to the LGBTQ2S+ community. You'll also find things like an employer checklist and guidelines. So this is a really great tool designed to help employers navigate workplace complaints of sexual harassment. And so it provides a checklist around the things that the employer is responsible for doing when they become aware of this alleged conduct. and some guidelines in terms of how to conduct your own internal investigation if that is needed, and or how to take the necessary steps to retain a third party to do so. And there also is a sample workplace harassment policy on the website, which is a really critical tool. You may or may not be aware, but in 2019, our Occupational Health and Safety Act in New Brunswick was amended to include a requirement that all employers in the province of New Brunswick who are provincially regulated must have a policy with respect to workplace harassment. The broader term of harassment, sexual harassment, being a form of harassment in the workplace. And so not only are employers now legally required to have policies, they also must train their employees on those policies. And so on the Safer Places NB website, you will find a template policy that really is meant to be a bit of a plug and play. And so any organization can take this policy and adapt it and modify it to their own needs. The other thing I will say about this policy is that it is not restricted only to address workplace sexual harassment, but rather is broader in nature and deals with all forms of workplace harassment. So if an organization took and adopted this policy, then it would meet the requirements under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So that's just kind of my introduction around some of the material that you have access to. So I want to back up just a little bit before we get into the meat of the program this morning to talk a little bit about how we, as sort of the project partners, got to the place that we're at now. And so back in the fall of 2019, PLEIS NB and the New Brunswick Human Rights Commission engaged in a public consultation process. And the purpose of that process was to essentially gather insight and information from the community with respect to the workplace or the issue, of workplace sexual harassment. And so the intended goal was to ask questions about the prevalence of this kind of behavior in the workplace. Who are the targets of this kind of behavior? What are the problems? What are the barriers that have prevented us and the challenges that have prevented us from effectively dealing with these issues? And, for those of you that are participating, I think that you won't be overly surprised in terms of the prevalence that was determined through this public consultation process. I mean, I can certainly tell you, I'll share my background a little bit, and you have no obligation to do so, but certainly, as a woman, I have experienced various forms of harassment in my lifetime, personally and professionally. And I think you'd be hard pressed to find a woman that didn't have some version of a story in terms of having experienced some disrespectful behavior, whether that is on the spectrum from anything to, say, catcalling to, at the other end of the spectrum, sexual assault. And so certainly, and I'm a lawyer, and I've experienced these circumstances in my personal and professional career. And as I said, in my experience, I've been hard pressed to find others who have not had some form of exposure to disrespectful or harassing behavior. So I think what we're going to do now is Matt's going to run a poll here. And what we would like you to kind of answer is, do you think that workplace sexual harassment has or continues to happen in your workplace? That's the first question. And secondly, would you know how to respond if someone came to you with that kind of complaint? You can go ahead and give your answers now, please.
I'll give people another 5 or 10 seconds to answer. We've got about halfway there.
Okay. Okay, Matt, let's close the poll and see what our results are. Okay, so for those of you that responded, 61% of you think that workplace sexual harassment either has or is happening in your own workplace. That's probably a very accurate statistic, frankly, and 16% said no. Congratulations to those of you that do not believe that that is an issue in your workplace, and 24% are unsure. And so would you know how to respond? And this is actually an interesting result. So 74% of you said that you would know how to respond if someone came to you with a complaint of workplace sexual harassment. That's interesting because in my experience as a lawyer that works in this area, oftentimes I find my employer clients certainly understand that they are obligated to do something with that information or that complaint, but the how to go about properly addressing it can sometimes be a bit of a challenge. So thank you for those that participated in the poll. So what I want to talk about next is some of the results of this public consultation process that we discovered. So again, recall that some of the information that we wanted to know before building training programs, tools, material was what are the barriers and the challenges in workplace that have prevented us from effectively addressing this issue to date. And we discovered all kinds of themes, and this public consultation process involved all kinds of community partners, from employers to employees, union representatives, corporate representatives, municipalities. So we cast that net as broadly as we could to gain further insight. And as some of the themes that we discovered was that power dynamics and fear was often a challenge or a barrier in workplaces in terms of addressing sexual harassment. And so by that, we mean that harassers are often in a position of power over the targeted person. So think about the structural organization or the structural positions of power within an organization. So a manager, an employee, instructor, student, for example. So there are those power dynamics that exist that make it difficult to effectively address workplace sexual harassment. But we also have power dynamics as it relates to historical and societal norms. So think about, the power dynamics that come with persons of different sex, persons of gender who identify their gender differently, persons who may have a lesser position of power based on race, religion, sexual orientation. So we have these historical and societal power dynamics that also are existing within workplaces that effectively make it more challenging for individuals and for organizations to address this behavior. What we also heard quite resoundingly was that within organizations, there is a fear by targets of not being believed or taken seriously. And there's also what was identified as patterns of discrimination, lack of understanding, and culture of tolerance. So lack of education and understanding around with respect to issues of sex, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, leads to a lot of assumptions about and microaggressions, inappropriate sexualized comments, etc. Intersectionality was certainly a piece, and that you're going to hear about later in the program, that was flagged for us during this public consultation process. And essentially for members of the LGBTQ2S+ community, workplace sexual harassment often is not the first or only form of harassment they have faced in their lifetime. And so the reality is, for those persons who have been victimized in another form or format in their lifetime, they're often reluctant to sort of rock the boat in fear of facing further negative consequences. And so the other thing that we heard, and again, you're going to see this in the material as we go through, because this public consultation process really informed how we developed the materials and the programs. What we've heard is that overt forms of workplace sexual harassment have largely been replaced with what is called microaggressions. And microaggressions are hostile, derogatory, negative slights and insult. And I often refer to microaggressions as sort of a death by 1,000 cuts. It is the small little hostile acts, comments, gestures that have largely replaced what we would think, what we sort of recall as traditional workplace sexual harassment. And so those are some of the barriers and challenges. What we've also heard through that process was that organizations' policies, for the most part, were regarded as being immature. Immature in terms of not being fulsome or clear enough, often drafted in binary language. So he, she, him, her, which of course, as I mentioned in my introductory comments, that binary approach to workplace sexual harassment has left to the margins of the discourse many other members of the LGBTQ2S+ community. What we also heard from participants was issues around communication. So someone would come to their employer to report allegations of harassment, and they have no control over what happens next. They get little feedback or guidance or communication with the organization. And so they often feel like they have been sort of sucked into this vacuum of a lack of response and a lack of information. And so we took all of that information from the public consultation process, and those were just some highlights that I've given you. But what we really identified as being needed was training on the issue and resources. And I love that in that initial poll, so many of you said that you would know what to do if someone came to you with a complaint of workplace sexual harassment. I suspect that a lot of you work in this space, and so that's very encouraging to hear. I can tell you that in New Brunswick, we, as you all know, we have sort of a large spattering of organizations from small, medium to large corporations. And a lot of our province is rural in nature, and a lot of organizations just simply don't have the training and the resources necessary to properly prevent and address workplace harassment. And so training certainly has been identified as a big piece of what is needed in the province, and that is training with respect to what is workplace sexual harassment, right? Training with respect to sensitivity and awareness. What happens if you're a bystander? What are the things that you should do if you are witness to this kind of behavior? Trauma-informed training, leadership, investigation. Around the leadership piece, what we also heard during the consultation process is that within an organization, tone comes from the top. And so if our leaders are condoning inappropriate behavior, that then sends a message throughout the rest of the organization that the behavior is tolerable and or is okay. And the investigation piece, again, a lot of employers are sort of know and understand that they have to do something meaningful with a complaint of workplace harassment, but the steps necessary to ensure that procedurally all of the parties have been treated fairly are not something that's always intuitive. And so training is necessary on that. We also clearly identified that several resources were needed. And so that the resources, the primary resources that were developed were things like a harassment policy. You'll recall my description of that when we gave you the introduction for the Safer Spaces NB website. We've also developed a communication protocol and flow chart for complaints. And so that's in the employer checklist and response guidelines. So what we've essentially tried to do is give employers a guidebook in terms of how to respond when they receive a complaint of workplace harassment or otherwise become aware of allegations, and resource maps as well. So that was what was identified out of the public consultation process. And out of that process, as I said, this program, training program, and the associated resources have been developed. So today, my goal is, we have essentially 4 goals that we would like to obtain today in terms of learning outcomes for you folks as participants. So firstly, I'm hopeful that we can help build your understanding of what workplace sexual harassment is and who tends to be the target of that behavior. Now, you might be saying, Trish, we know what workplace sexual harassment is, right? And in the interactive sessions, what I often ask people to do is imagine a scenario of workplace sexual harassment and then explain that to me. And oftentimes the response that I get, 9 times out of 10, is this scenario of an older male and a younger female. And oftentimes it is the older male who's likely in a position of power, maybe putting his hand on the shoulder of the younger female, or sort of flirting type behavior. And I would challenge you to actually Google examples of workplace sexual harassment. And most often the videos, or the certainly not the descriptor, but the videos, the training videos, it will be of that form and format, right? And so because of, and don't get me wrong, those are absolutely forms of workplace sexual harassment, but many of you on the line are going to know and understand that when we talk about why workplace sexual harassment happens, it is very often has nothing to do with desire and all to do with power. And so there are many, many other forms of workplace sexual harassment that we're going to learn about today, including what we call gender-based, or what is called gender-based harassment. Okay, and then we want to build your understanding about how to prevent and address workplace sexual harassment. Again, I know many of you have said, look, I would know what to do, but let's build on that approach and that understanding. We want to build organizations' capacity and competence for responding to complaints. And again, that's a piece of utilizing the resources that have been developed as part of this program. And then finally, increasing readiness to take action, because certainly the fact that that this issue continues to exist within our workplaces to the degree and the prevalence that it does remains obviously very concerning. Okay, so we're going to get into the program now in terms of program details. And we're going to start off about talking about prevalence and the targets of this kind of behavior. So we're going to start right out of the gate with another poll. And Matt, if you wouldn't mind running this poll, but the question that we are asking you to answer is, what percentage of workers report having experienced workplace harassment? So what do you think the answer is? 10%, 30%, or 60%? This is Canadian workers. How many folks do you think have reported experiencing some form of workplace harassment?
I'll give people about 5 more seconds and then we'll close out the poll.
Great, thanks, Matt. Okay, so it looks like 38% of you thought that 10% of workers said that they had experienced some form of workplace harassment. 45% of you said 30, and 18% said 60. Very interesting. So the correct response is actually 60%. So most of you will obviously are surprised to hear that response. And so this survey was based on a federal survey done back in 2017, but essentially there was a cross-Canada public consultation process on workplace harassment, broadly speaking. And harassment, of those who responded to the survey, 60% of Canadians said that during their lifetime that they had experienced some form of workplace harassment. I will say harassment of a non-sexual nature was the most common type of behavior reported. So there I'm talking about what we call bullying or psychological harassment. That was the most common form. And certainly what this survey also made very clear was that persons with disability and visible minorities were more likely to experience harassment than other groups. What this survey also told us is that when it comes to sexual harassment, that 30% of respondents in that same survey said that they had experienced sexual harassment. So out of the 60, 30% said that they had experienced sexual harassment. 94% of that group were women. So what does that tell us? So that tells us that women are very predominantly a target of workplace sexual harassment. Sorry, we just see something in the chat there. Matt, maybe you can address the chat. And so what that tells us, again, in terms of prevalence, is that workplace sexual harassment is, women are predominantly the targets of that behavior, but we also know that members, visible minorities, persons with disabilities, and members of the LGBTQ2S+ community are also disproportionately a target. And so we're going to run another poll here. Matt, if you wouldn't mind pulling up this poll. So here, I'd like to see what your response is with respect to, what do you think the percentage is of LGBTQ community members reporting having experienced a form of workplace harassment?
I'll give about 5 more seconds.
Great, thanks, Matt. Okay, so 84% of you have chose 47%, meaning 84% of you think that 40% of the LGBTQ2S+ persons who responded to the survey reported experienced a form of workplace harassment based on their sexual orientation. And you're absolutely correct. And I probably gave that away when I said that this group of vulnerable persons is often disproportionately a target. That comes from a study that was done in 2016 by EGAL Canada. And what we also know, so just quick recap, we know that women and members of the LGBTQ2S+ community are disproportionately targets of workplace sexual harassment. But what we also know within those statistics is that transgender and gender variant community members also are the most severely impacted of that community. And so they are most often targets of that kind of behavior. And so because of this research and the statistics and the discourse that has happened over the years, as I said in the beginning of my remarks, this is one of the reasons why this particular training program has a focus on the LGBTQ2S+ community. Now, on the Safer Places NB website, you will find a terminology guide with respect to the LGBTQ2S+ community. Given the alarming rate that this behavior happens to members of this community, it is important to take some time to explore the terminology and the unique experience of this community. The terminology is not meant to obviously cover all acronyms or explanations, but it is meant to be a fairly comprehensive guide for individuals and organizations to use. But you will see on your screen, we have some of the commonly used important terminology in terms of how the term lesbian is defined, a bisexual person, a gay person, transgender person. And we have a definition of queer, which is an umbrella term used by some, not all in the community. Two-spirit is another definition in terms of an Indigenous cultural identity used by some Indigenous people to describe their sexual, gender, and or spiritual nature as having both a masculine and feminine spirit. And so what I would encourage you to take a look at the website and review the terminology on the handout that we have created for you. So now I want to talk just a little bit about what the impacts are of this behavior. So workplace sexual harassment has all kinds of impacts on the individual employee. And so they are things like decreased job satisfaction, increased likelihood of leaving, stress, poor mental health. So if I'm the target of workplace sexual harassment, then the impact can often be very devastating, right? I no longer like my job in the way that I might have otherwise. Chances are I'm going to look at leaving because a lot of organizations don't have an effective response to this kind of behavior. It's very, very stressful. For those of you that have experienced this type of behavior or any type of workplace conflict, you're going to know and understand that when you leave your work at the end of the day, those issues and that stress associated with it do not stay with the bricks and mortar of the building, right? It becomes a bit of a monkey on your back. You have that with you all of the time. And obviously, all of that cumulative stress can have an impact on your mental health. And while these negative effects are common for all targets of workplace sexual harassment, they're often multiplied for vulnerable persons, including LGBTQ2S+ community members, visible minorities, newcomers, immigrants, persons with disability, etc. So I also want to point out the fact that these impacts are not only felt by employees who are the target of workplace sexual harassment, but also by colleagues and bystanders, right? And so it has a multiplication effect within an organization. So we are, the next sort of piece of what I want to talk about as it relates to the impacts felt by employees is this concept of intersectionality. So intersectionality, you can ignore the activity piece on the side of this screen, but I want to explain a little bit of what intersectionality is, and then we're going to watch a quick video on it. But the point about intersectionality is to raise awareness with respect to your social identity and how that may impact how you experience life and move through the world. So none of us experience life in the same way. We're not just one identity, right? We have different parts of us. And belonging to various minority groups can compound the effects of discrimination and harassment. So as a cisgender woman, I experience life in a particular way. But somebody who has, for example, maybe of a lower socioeconomic status and who identifies with a race that is perhaps a person is a newcomer or an immigrant or is Black or is an Indigenous person, and maybe they're also of a different language. So you can see how our different aspects of our social identity can work together to compound how we experience life, including issues of harassment and discrimination. And so these different pieces of our social identity certainly shape how we move through the world and how we experience the world.
Hey, Betsy. What's the long face?
Hi, Dave. I just got off the phone with my wife. She is having issues at work still.
Oh, no. What's happening?
Well, as I'm sure you know, my wife is Hispanic. She moved to the United States from the Dominican Republic many years ago. Even though she's lived in the US for many years, people are sometimes still hard on her because of her accent.
Wow. Is that why there's issues at work?
Well, that's one of the reasons. Her boss seems to be passing her up for opportunities, and she's just had it. She thinks her boss doesn't like her accent, and after he found out that she was married to a woman, the tension at work got even higher. I feel so awful for her. I wish I knew how to help.
Has she talked to Human Resources about her concerns?
We have discussed that, and I think it will be the next step. It's just tough for her in this situation because she isn't sure where his hostility is coming from.
What do you mean by that?
Have you heard about the theory of intersectionality?
No, actually. What is that?
Intersectionality is the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender as they apply to a given individual or group, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage.
Could you explain that a little more simply?
Sorry about that. Basically, it's the idea that we are not just one identity. We have many parts of us. You, myself, and my wife are all part of the LGBTQ community, right?
Yes, and my boyfriend too.
Yeah, exactly. Except we all four belong to other groups that make us who we are. Unfortunately, some of us are part of other minority groups that are also discriminated against. My wife, for example, is a Hispanic, lesbian woman. These different points of her intersect, and it creates double and even triple discrimination at times.
Geez, Betsy, I hadn't even thought about that before.
That's all right, Dave. We've spent so much time focusing on segmented groups to promote diversity, but it goes so far beyond that. When my wife or anyone else that belongs to multiple minority groups feels discriminated against, it is difficult to understand the cause or even how to approach the situation. My wife, for example, isn't sure if she is experiencing homophobia, sexism, or racism, or even a combination.
Wow, that is really sad when you think about it. Intersectionality isn't something I'd ever considered before, but you're right. Even though we're all a part of the LGBTQ community, none of us experience life in the same way.
Exactly, Dave. Intersectionality is the belief that oppressions are interlinked and cannot be solved alone. This is the pivot of diversity. The more we take the time to get to know and understand people from all walks of life and stop trying to fit ourselves and others into one category, the better off we will be as a society.
I agree, Betsy. I hope things get better for your wife. We've made great strides in universal acceptance, but there's still a long way to go.
Thank you, Dave. I hope so too. And I definitely agree. It is important to truly listen to others and examine our own privileges. I hope we can find a solution with her boss and for anyone else experiencing these issues, both within the workplace and out.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about what the impact is on employees, colleagues, bystanders of workplace sexual harassment. I want to talk now just a little bit about what the impacts are on your organization. If I had to sum it up, I would say harassment is unethical, it's illegal, and it's really, really expensive. So it results in very clearly trends of increased absenteeism, turnover within an organization, disability claims, mental health issues, and so it drives down productivity. Interestingly, in the US, the average company's cost of ignoring workplace sexual harassment is up to $6.7 million a year, which again includes those factors of low productivity and morale, employee turnover and absenteeism. There's also the cost of lawsuits for things like constructive dismissal. And so that constructive dismissal is a concept where an employee has not directly terminated, where an employer has not directly terminated an employee, but they've been breached what's called an implied term of the employment contract. So in every employment contract, there is an implied term that the employer will provide a safe and harassment-free workplace. And so if the employer fails to effectively prevent and respond to these kinds of claims, they open themselves up to these civil lawsuits, as well as complaints under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So monetary damages on the civil side can be very expensive. And there we're talking about damages in terms of a loss, past and future earnings, medical costs, care expenses. There's also under the Human Rights Act, the ability to file a complaint. An employee can file a complaint against their employer under that piece of legislation, under which the tribunal has the ability to award what's called general damages, to compensate an injured person for their pain and suffering, disfigurement. So the range of damages, whether it be a complaint under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, whether it be a complaint under the New Brunswick Human Rights Act, or a civil lawsuit, can be very, very expensive. And so for organizations, again, it's not only ethical for you to prevent and respond to these things, but it certainly is, it costs organizations a considerable amount of money by ignoring this kind of behavior. So now we're going to move on to defining and talking a little bit about what workplace sexual harassment is. And, you know, if I really had to, I know we talked about learning objectives at the beginning of the program, but if I really had two things that I wanted to leave with you today, it would be learning about the scope of what workplace sexual harassment actually looks like. Because, as I said to you, the traditional forms of what we recall as workplace sexual harassment have largely been replaced by microaggressions. Remember that sort of death by a thousand cuts analogy. And we don't have an understanding and appreciation of gender-based harassment. So we're going to explain those things. So if I leave you with that message of having a broader understanding of what workplace sexual harassment is, and giving you the tools to the resources to address those types of behaviors, I think that we will have satisfied our real goals for the training session this morning. So, as I said, the most common understanding of workplace sexual harassment is conduct such as making passes, soliciting sexual favors, questions about sexual activity, sexual touching. That's sort of the most commonly understood example of workplace sexual harassment. And that behavior absolutely does still exist, and it absolutely is a form of workplace sexual harassment. But it's not going to be a surprise, I think, to most of you on this webinar that often workplace sexual harassment is not about sexual desire or interest at all. It's about power and control, right? It often involves very deeply rooted sexist attitudes, negative assumptions, hostility, rejection, bullying, diminishing people based on their sex, are they male or female, gender expression, how they express their gender, and sexual orientation, who they're attracted to, right? There is this whole sphere of behavior that is so much less commonly understood. So we have another quick poll. I think we have one here. Matt, I'm just going to get you to run that. Thank you so much. So here we just want to we're giving you some sample scenarios, and I'm going to ask you to think about whether or not these scenarios constitute workplace sexual harassment. So you can go ahead and start answering them now. The first one is an example that Jake is gay, and that's wrong morally, but you don't want to be rude, so you go out of your way to avoid Jake so it doesn't come up. Is that workplace sexual harassment? The second scenario is, Stephen, I just heard your mom passed away. I'm so sorry. And you give that Stephen a big hug. Is that workplace sexual harassment? And then finally, calling women in the workplace names such as sweetheart, little lady, sweetie, hun. What about that? Is that workplace sexual harassment?
I'll give about 5 or 10 more seconds. You're still muted, Trisha.
Thanks, Matt. You know, I actually have this coffee mug and I meant to bring it in with me this morning, but it actually says you're on mute. So you could have just pointed at the mug. In any event, thank you for that. So let's talk about scenario number one. So the scenario reads, Jake is gay. You believe that that's wrong morally, but you don't want to be rude. So you just kind of avoid Jake. You go out of your way so that it doesn't come up. Is that a form of workplace sexual harassment? 91% of you said it was. Congratulations, that's absolutely the correct response, and not everyone gets that. Ostracization based on sexual orientation is a form of workplace sexual harassment. I'm going to give you an example that is non-gender specific, but in my work, I do a lot of workplace investigation. So within an organization, if an employer receives a complaint from one of its employees that they have been targeted by harassing behavior, sometimes an organization will hire an outside investigator to come in and investigate that complaint. And they can do that for all kinds of reasons. And so that's a big piece of work that I do in my company. And so I did an investigation in an industrial setting in the last couple of years. There was one complainant, 5 respondents, and the complainant alleged that he and the group of respondents, the respondents being the persons against whom the complainant said was engaging in this harassing behavior, basically, they had a falling out over a union matter around overtime work and how, what stance the members of the union were going to take vis-a-vis the employer. So they had this sort of falling out about a union issue. And then this group of respondents just started ignoring the complainant. So they used to eat at the same lunch table for 30 plus years. They were kind of chums in the workplace, didn't necessarily hang out outside of the workplace, but certainly were chummy, having worked together for all of those years. And so they just started ignoring him. And as he passed in the hallway, they would look down. No overt rude behavior. Certainly nothing that was sort of an active behavior or comment, gesture. But they just kind of ignored him. And when I asked them why they did that, so many of them said to me, look, my mom told me when I was growing up that if I didn't have something nice, don't say anything at all, right? How many of our mamas told us that if you have nothing nice to say, don't say anything at all? The problem with that, though, is that it creates an environment of isolation. And ostracization is actually one of the oldest forms of social punishment, right? Think of the Scarlet Letter. We banish those, we ignore those, based on differences. And so you're absolutely right that that is a form of workplace sexual harassment. And I say sexual harassment because it's a form of gender-based harassment, right? It's ostracizing Jake because he identifies as gay. His sexual orientation, he is gay. So the second scenario was, Stephen, I just heard that your mom passed. I'm so sorry, gives a big hug. Is this workplace sexual harassment? Interestingly, 60% of you said no. You think hugging is okay. I like the 29% of you that say you're not sure, right? Because you know what? We don't know. We don't know. And the reason we don't know is because context matters. And in fairness, I don't give you all the context in these questions because I want to see what you're going to say. And I want you to be a little bit confused by it because context always matters. So imagine that the scenario where Stephen, I don't know him very well, but he's a relatively new coworker in my company. And I just heard that his mom passed away and I give him a big hug, right? I have no context with Stephen. I have no background. We don't know each other well. In that context, that's not a form of workplace sexual harassment, right? Best practice is to ask him first, are you comfortable with that? Can I give you a hug? Certainly that is best practice, but that one instance in and of itself would not, from a legal perspective, meet the definition of workplace sexual harassment. But if I knew Stephen relatively well, we had worked together for a while, and I knew that Stephen was uncomfortable with physical contact, right? And I go and I hug him anyway. That could be, we are now getting along that line of, is that inappropriate conduct, right? Because I knew that behavior was unwelcome and therefore offensive to Stephen. So context matters. Now also imagine that, again, going back to the first scenario, I don't know Stephen well, I give him a hug, he hugs me back, right? What does that say? Well, contextually, that gives me a cue that behavior was welcome in that moment, right? But what if Stephen freezes? What if I'm hugging him so very tightly and he just freezes and he looks mortified? Well, again, that instance may not in and of itself be an example of workplace sexual harassment, but if I did it again, or if I did something else to invade his physical space, that could be, because I've been put on notice by his response that is not conduct that is welcome to him. And some of this will tie together as we get into the legal definition of workplace harassment, but I want you to remember context, and I want you to remember how we know behavior is welcome or not. Okay, and the third scenario, calling women in the workplace names such as sweetheart, little lady, sweetie, hun. 89% of you said that is a form of workplace harassment. You're absolutely right. This kind of nomenclature, and look, we know that it exists, and it exists all throughout the country, all throughout the province. But it really is diminishment on the basis of sex and gender, right? So when somebody calls me sweetie or hun within an organization, especially if it's coming, frankly, from a man, that is, I feel personally, that it's a form of diminishment, right? Lesser than. And so the nomenclature in and of itself is not tolerable or accepted if it ever was. Okay, so thank you everyone for your participation in those responses. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the different forms of sexual harassment in the workplace. I've alluded to some of these already, or the distinction between the two already, but we're going to get into the details a little bit more. So on the first part of the screen, we have behavior that is in fact motivated by sexual desire, power, control, right? So the more traditionally understood forms of workplace harassment. So that was the sexual advances that we kind of talked about, sexual comments or questions, gestures that are motivated by sexual desire or control. But then we have this whole other subset of gender-based harassment. And this is behavior that is motivated by sexist attitudes, right? That, for example, women are less than, women don't belong in the construction industry, women can't be firefighters, they're lesser than as a constable, for example, they don't belong in the boardroom. It's also stereotyping of sexual identities and gender roles. And now when we talk about gender identity, we're talking about the inherent sense of being a man or woman or something distinct or in between, right? It's that inherent sense of how you identify, whether it's male, female, or something else. Gender expression is how we then express that intrinsic identity, right? How we express our gender characteristics, regardless of how we identify. Sexual orientation is really more about the attributes of who we are attracted to. And so it's important, I think, to kind of break down some of that terminology because it's not always clearly understood as well. And so here we have just a bit of a diagram around those descriptives. Now, each of these are protected under the New Brunswick Human Rights Act. If you were federally regulated, they are protected under the Canadian Human Rights Act. So this diagram is just meant to describe and help us understand the complexities of identity and how these four pieces of sex, being our biological determination of male or female, gender, again, remember how we identify, sexuality and expression, how they all relate to one another, because we often hear that terminology, but don't necessarily understand the differences between them. So this type of diagram, I just want to be clear, is helpful for starting a conversation. It's not meant to define any particular person or group of persons, but again, it helps us continue that conversation. And I do want to remind folks that we do have the Q&A function. And so if you have questions at any time, please feel free to pop it in there. So we've been talking now about the different forms of workplace harassment. Now I want to talk about how that shows up. And you've heard me mention this term before, microaggressions. Remember, for me, it's kind of that death by a thousand cuts. What we heard in that public consultation process and what I see in my work as an investigator, frankly, is that the overt forms of workplace sexual harassment, in large part, not always, have been replaced by these forms of microaggression. So thankfully, as a society, we have come to sort of realize that it's no longer to, within a workplace, sexually proposition your coworkers or smack somebody on the butt or comment about how they fill out a particular blouse or shirt. So look, don't get me wrong, those things still happen. I still investigate them, right? But in large part, those kinds of, we have sort of learned that overt behavior is not acceptable within a workplace. And it's been replaced by these behaviors that are not as blatant, and they are more subtle. And so they're harder, frankly, to detect for employers because they're not so in your face, right? And so if you don't understand them as employees or as employers, it is behavior that often flies under the radar. And so again, it's these kinds of small inappropriate comments, stereotyping, stigmatizing language. I'm going to give you some examples, but on the Safer Places NB website, there is a handout that you can print out entitled Microaggressions. And it's actually called tips on recognizing and preventing microaggression. So that's a more fulsome explanation of this terminology. Invite you to go on that space again and print off any of that material that is useful to you. But essentially, so stereotyping might be, an example of that might be women belong in the kitchen and not at the boardroom table, or, oh, that's so gay, right? It also is like promoting exclusively heteronormative behaviors. It can include ostracizing or ignoring women or members of the LGBTQ plus community members, visible minorities. It can be examples of stigmatizing with like slights and insults. And so all of those things are forms of microaggressions. And again, the problem with this kind of behavior is that it is very often very subtle and repeated. So we have to be on guard and watching for this kind of behavior. So what are some of the things that employers can do around microaggression? So obviously supporting respectful work environments. And for those of you that are on the call, it's obviously you take it very seriously as participating in this respectful work week. One thing that can be really helpful within organizations and that we actively promote is using gender neutral language. You will hear a lot about preference for pronouns within organizations. As lawyers within our company, we recommend to our clients that they use gender neutral language in all of their policies and procedures. And so that's replacing language like he, she with language like they, them, and to provide a more supportive and inclusive environment for members of the LGBTQ2+ community. You can also do things like hosting diversity training, helping people understand differences and respect differences in the workplace. Implement ways to deal with microaggressions in your harassment policies. So in the Safer Places NB website, as I said, there is a draft template for a workplace harassment policy that's meant to be this plug and play. It includes examples of microaggressions and how to deal with microaggressions within your workplace. Because the thing about microaggressions is while they might be not as blatant or subtly, they are equally as damaging to people, right? And so certainly something that we have to be educated about and promoting understanding and an appropriate response to those things. And then it's consulting and listening to your employees about their experiences within the workplace is also a really good way to support employees around this issue. So I'm just going to skip through our breakout room because we don't have that option this morning. And I'm going to talk to you now about the legal test. So this part is not super exciting for everybody else. As a lawyer, I always find it very exciting. So I want to talk to you about how we break down the definition of workplace harassment, because I told you, like, one of the things that I do is investigations. I also do a lot of training. So this is one form of training that I do on workplace sexual harassment. I do broader training on all forms. And so a question I always get asked, inevitably in every training session, is, are people just more sensitive these days? You know, like everybody gets their feelings hurt by everything. So that's often a comment. I will also get a question like, can you even tell people that they look nice anymore without somebody making a complaint of workplace sexual harassment? My response, I'm a little bit cheeky, is oftentimes you can just don't be a creep about it, right? Like don't be inappropriate. But we're going to break down the legal test so you can understand what your obligations are as an employer responding to these kinds of complaints, and the things that organizations like investigators like me or the Human Rights Commission or the Occupational Health and Safety commissioners are going to be looking at when they are faced with an allegation of workplace harassment. So let's break it down. Workplace sexual harassment is defined as sexual, sexualized, and or gender-based, we talked about the distinction, conduct, comments, or gestures in the workplace that is unwelcome and that causes harm, actual or reasonably perceived. So in the law, we find all kinds of places to get definitions of workplace harassment. So we find definitions in human rights legislation and jurisprudence. We find definitions in occupational health and safety jurisprudence and legislation. We find definitions in the common law, which in my world is judge-made law. And so, but taking all of those components together, we can distill a definition that looks like this. So it's the sexual, sexualized, or gender-based conduct, comments, or gestures that's unwelcome and that causes harm, okay? So breaking that down further, let's talk about the conduct, comments, or gestures piece. So that has to happen either on a one-time basis, but if it's a one-time basis, it has to have a significant and lasting impact. Otherwise, we are looking for a pattern of behavior. So what does that tell us? That tells us that people can make mistakes, right? People can say things that are inappropriate. People can make a comment, conduct, or gesture that might be inappropriate. It's not going to constitute workplace sexual harassment unless it has a severe and significant lasting impact, okay? Now, I'm not giving people permission to behave inappropriately on a one-time basis. I'm just saying from a legal perspective, we are typically looking for a pattern of behavior because most often what the research tells us and what the law tells us is that the impact oftentimes is generated by the repetition, right? That's really where the harm comes in, is the repeated conduct. So it can be a one-time conduct, comment, or gesture, but it must have a significant and lasting impact. Otherwise, we're looking for patterns of behavior. Again, we're talking about the legal test. As employers, you need to nip this in the bud. If you see it one time, two times, don't let it continue, right? Because remember, once it becomes a pattern, it's most often going to meet that legal definition of harassment, right? And so this is not sort of a get out of jail free card in terms of folks can, behave inappropriately on a one-time basis and the employer has no obligation to do anything about it. I just want you to understand what we're looking for in terms of meeting a legal definition. It's generally the repetition that causes the harm. Okay, so that's the first thing. And we talked before about the difference between what we traditionally understand and know workplace sexual harassment is, and then we talked about gender-based comments, conduct, behavior, and that was the stereotyping and ostracization and all of those types of behaviors based on sex, gender, sexual orientation. So the second component of the test, let's move down the ladder a little bit, is that it's behavior that's unwelcome. So remember my example about Stephen and the hug, right? And I gave you all of those scenarios about how I would know or not know if Stephen welcomed that behavior. So there's two ways that we essentially know whether or not a person is welcoming of behavior. Either they tell us that they are or they aren't, right? So they verbalized, I liked that, I didn't like that, please don't do that again. That's less common than the circumstantial behavior, right? So the circumstances of us having to look at someone's tone, reaction, demeanor, in determining whether or not behavior was unwelcome. So in the example about Stephen that I gave you, if I go up and I don't know Stephen well, but he's just lost his mom, so I give him this big hug. And in one example, he hugs me back and says, thank you so much. I really appreciate the support. Based on his reaction, I would believe that hug to be welcome in the circumstances. Doesn't mean he's always going to want to be hugged, but in the circumstances, that was welcomed behavior. If, though, he froze or stiffened or looked the other way and was visibly or physically uncomfortable with that behavior, I am now in the know that that kind of behavior is not welcome by Stephen. It doesn't mean that that hug, that one instance, was workplace sexual harassment, but it does mean if I do it again, it very well may be, right? Because then we are looking at patterns of behavior. And at that point, I've been essentially notified that that behavior is unwelcome. And then the third component of this test is that the behavior, whether that's the conduct, comments, or gestures, has caused harm. And so that harm can be actual harm, but it also can be reasonably perceived harm. And so it's not, as I said before, one of the things that I want to leave with you is that even though, for the most part, overt forms of workplace sexual harassment have been replaced with microaggressions, that's not always the case, A, and B, that behavior is just as damaging and harmful as more overt forms. Okay, so now we did talk, one of the things that is also important in terms of this definition of workplace harassment, I'm going to go back quickly. Let's look at number one. If all of this behavior is happening in the workplace, right? So it's the workplace component that, for the purposes of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, the Human Rights Act, and civil lawsuits around constructive dismissal, the behavior must happen in the workplace. So what is the workplace? Well, frankly, it's never been as expansive after a worldwide pandemic, right? Firstly, the law very clearly delineates that the workplace is any space or situation where business is carried out or business affiliated activities are carried out. So that can be your physical office, right? The bricks and mortar of your building. That can be, and this is important in this context of a post-pandemic world, or hopefully soon post-pandemic world, online communications. So Zoom, email, Teams meetings, text messages, all of these virtual platforms is a form of the workspace. Business travel, conferences, training sessions, work-related social gatherings. That one is really important because not all employees understand that the office Christmas party or the summer barbecue lunch or the event where employees are getting together after work, having a drink for a work-related purpose, right? Maybe they're strategizing for an upcoming client meeting. All of those fall under the category of workplace, right? And so being cognizant of that and being cognizant of the rise in behavior when things like stimulants and alcohol are involved is also really important. Breaking down, again, we're still kind of just talking with the different components of this legal test, and we did talk about this a little bit around the one-time or repeated basis. And as I said before, normally more than one act or event has to be present to meet the legal definition, because it is that often that the repetition that generates the harm. But we did talk about that one instance can meet this legal test of workplace sexual harassment if it's severe and has a significant and lasting impact. The other thing that's important to note is that in the case of sexual harassment, a single incident might be more significant where one party has control or influence over the other, right? And so I say that because context is always going to matter. So two colleagues, one instance is in one category potentially, but in the case of power dynamics, so think structural dynamics, it very possibly could be viewed as more significant if it was a supervisor and a subordinate. Okay. So, all right. So, oh, sorry, a little too fast. Okay. So welcome. So again, we talked about this piece as well in terms of how do we know whether or not behavior is welcome or not. Two components of that. The person is told that the conduct is unwelcome. We know, especially in where power dynamics are at play, and think about that concept of intersectionality and people feeling that intrinsic power to speak up is not always present. And so what the law imposes is a reasonable person. So in all of the circumstances, would a reasonable person have known that the behavior was unwelcome? And so that reasonable person is required to look at the context of the situation. And then this piece is important equally as well, because motive, as it relates to workplace sexual harassment, is completely irrelevant. And so it doesn't matter whether or not a person intended to cause harm. What matters is that the harm was caused. And so I think here, Matt, were you going to jump in around questions? I saw something in the chat here.
That's right. I see that Brenda Moore has your hand up, but I don't see a question put in the chat. So what I'm going to do, Brenda, is I'm going to allow you, there's a button here that says allow you to talk. We're going to find out what happens when I push that. And then you should be able to unmute your mic and ask your question if you like. And if you'd rather not ask using your voice, please feel free to type it either in the chat or in the Q&A.
Okay, so while feel free to jump in anytime. And Brenda, if you do have that question, I'm just going to do one more slide, and then what we'll do is take a 10-minute break, folks. So the last thing I just kind of want to talk about is who are the targets of this kind of behavior. So you'll remember that at the beginning of the session, we talked about how women and vulnerable persons, including visible minorities, persons with disabilities, members of the LGBTQ2S+ community, tend to be the targets of this behavior. And so we know that to be true based on the research and statistics. But it's also important to understand who the behavior can occur between. So it certainly can be between coworkers and coworkers. It can be between a subordinate actually harassing a supervisor. You know, we've given the example of the reverse of that, but certainly the opposite is true, and I have seen it in my work. Men harassing women, women harassing men, same-sex harassment with men harassing other men, women harassing other women. Think of that bullying context. Sexual orientation and gender identity harassment. There's also, of course, third-party harassment by customers, suppliers, visitors of organizations, right? So all of these folks can be the target of and or perpetrator of workplace sexual harassment. So we're going to move on now to talking just a little bit briefly about other forms of workplace harassment. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these details because obviously the program is designed around workplace sexual harassment, but I certainly wanted you to know and understand that there are other forms of workplace harassment as well. So that includes what's called poisonous work environment, personal or psychological harassment, workplace violence, and abuse of authority. And if I had to summarize them quickly, I would say that poisonous work environment is where harassing behavior is occurring around an individual, but not necessarily to them. So that might be something where, for example, an employee is witnessing someone else being the target of workplace harassment, whether it be bullying, sexual harassment, what have you, and that then creates a poisonous work environment for them as well. And so remember when I said earlier that the effects of workplace sexual harassment impacts not only the target of that behavior, but also colleagues and bystanders, and that can actually actually lead to separate complaints of workplace harassment under this umbrella of poisonous work environment. We also have personal and psychological harassment. I suppose the easiest way to think about that type of behavior is bullying. It also can be personal harassment based on a protected ground under the New Brunswick Human Rights Act, but it is not limited to harassment based on a protected ground. Workplace violence, obviously acts of perceived or actual physical violence in the workplace. And abuse of authority is where someone in a position of authority, uses the power associated with that position in an illegitimate way. And so acts in an abusive or misuse of power that serves no legitimate work purpose. So that's sort of a high level summary of the other forms of harassment that you should be aware of. One other thing I will say is that the sample policy found on the Safer Places NB website does include definitions of all of these forms of harassment and procedures in terms of how to prevent and address, and gives examples of these forms. So it's an all-encompassing, inclusive policy that will meet the legal requirements under the Occupational Health and Safety Act to have that policy. Now, of course, you are required to also train your folks on the policy as well. So just in terms of giving some examples of what workplace sexual harassment is, you'll see here on the screen, we've got a number of different boxes that give examples of how workplace sexual harassment shows up. So we've talked about sexual advances, again, that being a sort of a more traditionally or commonly understood form of workplace sexual harassment. Rude or sexually degrading remarks or offensive remarks or gestures, sexual or sexually suggestive name calling, questions, suggestions, or remarks about a person's sex life. On that particular example, when we did the public consultation process, one form of feedback that we received most often from members of the LGBTQ2S+ community was that they often faced inappropriate questions by coworkers with respect to their gender expression or sexuality. So for example, if a person is trans, questions being asked in terms of who that they then are sexually attracted to. So a barrage of inappropriate questions based on a person's gender expression, sexual orientation, or sex that is sort of guised in curiosity. And so again, a sort of a form of microaggression because it's guised in curiosity and guised in perhaps supportiveness, but very inappropriate and very uncomfortable for the target of that, that comment, conduct, or gesture. Another form of workplace sexual harassment can be spreading malicious gossip or rumors of a sexual nature, unwelcome social invitation with sexual overtones like flirting, belittling a person by making fun of their sex, sexuality, sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression, inappropriate inquiries about a person's sex life, sexual preferences, and autonomy. I gave an example of that just a few moments ago. Placing a condition of a sexual nature on employment, displaying pictures like pornography or circulating emails of a sexual nature. Those are all forms of workplace sexual harassment. And, you know, oftentimes, and I said this before, that when I do these training programs in a variety of different contexts, I often get these kinds of responses. And so, you know, the response that, you know, the lines are so confusing now. Everything is so gray. I don't know how I can talk to coworkers anymore. Maybe I shouldn't say anything. Maybe I shouldn't meet with women anymore alone, or maybe I shouldn't have a conversation with somebody who is a member of the LGBTQ2S+ community because I don't want to offend them, right? Can you even compliment anyone anymore? Are people just more sensitive these days? I hear that one often. I hear this one as well. I'm not meeting with a woman alone again. It's just not safe. Not going to do that. Oh, and this one is really, really prevalent. Oh, that's just so-and-so. That's just Sam, or that's John, or that's Tina. Or, you know, that's just so-and-so. And what am I supposed to do? Fire them? They're a great worker. They're a family person. They don't mean any harm. It's a generational thing, right? So we hear these things all of the time. And, it's at the end of the day, time's up for all of these immature responses, frankly. And we've seen that with the Me Too and Time's Up movements across the globe. And we've seen that there is now an increased need for responding to questions and comments like this, right? Because we require society to do better. We require to better define and differentiate amongst different types of offenses so that we understand them and can prevent them and address them in the way that they should. No longer should these sort of innocuous comments or gestures be brushed under the carpet, microaggressions being permitted. These are all things that we need to tackle. But in response to questions and comments like this, because it does happen all the time, and following the Me Too movement and the Time's Up movement, there is a professor, Kathleen Kelly Reardon, Professor Emerita. She developed a spectrum, and it's called the Spectrum of Sexual Misconduct at Work. And the purpose of the spectrum was to differentiate amongst types and severity of gender-based offenses. And it's really what this spectrum is intended to be as a blueprint for people and organizations to use in becoming familiar with different levels of offense that can cause harm to work relationships or perpetuate or cause hostile work environments. And so knowing where a behavior falls on this spectrum depends on the situation, the history of the parties in terms of their relationship, tone of delivery, nonverbal action. So remember, I've been saying context is important, and that's being solidified in this spectrum in terms of recognizing that where a particular act, comment, or gesture falls on the spectrum does depend on that context. But you'll see that the spectrum ranges at the top of the level at number 1 is conducts that are generally not offensive, right down to egregious sexual misconduct. And if you are, this is helpful for a couple of reasons. It's helpful for individuals, employees in workplaces, because one of the other things that we heard during the public consultation process is that people themselves are not necessarily sure if they are being targeted by workplace sexual harassment. They know they feel uncomfortable. They know that a particular question, comment, query, gesture was uncomfortable, and they don't feel right with that. But they're not comfortable necessarily naming that as a form of workplace sexual harassment. This gives them a tool to say, actually, that behavior is not okay. What it also does for employers on the flip side is help you identify the severity of the conduct, right? So it helps you identify whether or not you are dealing with a matter that requires education and training, or is it a matter that requires discipline, or both? Is it a matter that requires termination of employment? So this gives you that kind of spectrum and that fluid tool to become familiar with the different level of offenses and then what to do about that offense. And so, as I said, we have the spectrum goes from 1 to 6, and it starts as generally not offensive, awkward, mildly offensive, to offensive at number 3, highly offensive at number 4, evident sexual misconduct at 5, and egregious sexual misconduct at number 6. So I'm going to give you some examples of each of these levels to put it in context. Level 1. So this is generally not offensive behavior. If this happens, again, context is always going to matter, right? So we can't talk in absolutes, but generally speaking, this is not going to be offensive. Comments like, you look nice today. I like your haircut. That's a nice outfit. Geez, that's a good color on you. Now recognize that's distinct from saying, that's a nice outfit versus, I really like how that skirt actuates your buttocks, right? Or, I really like how you fill out that blouse, right? That's different than saying, that's a nice outfit. So when I get asked the question, like, can I give a compliment to anybody? Absolutely you can. Just don't be creepy about it, right? Don't be offensive about it. You can do these things, and I have faith in you that you can do them well. Number 2. So this is behavior, we're starting to move down to the spectrum that is awkward and mildly offensive. So this is behavior that is not okay and that we want to be checking as employers, but certainly you're not at a point where you are, this is sort of an educational type of level, right? So it might be comments like, you would say that as a gay person, or you would say that as a woman, which again is based on a stereotype. I suppose it's a woman's prerogative to change her mind, or some other similar type of stereotype, right? Like, oh, you're gay, so you must like these kinds of movies, right? We can't speak frankly around women anymore. So it's the comments that, again, they're based on stereotypes and a normalization of those stereotypes, and they're awkwardly, mildly offensive, not okay, not at the point where, to me, this sort of screams education within an organization. So now we're getting down to offensive behavior. We're crossing kind of that more concrete line. And this, again, remember that motive doesn't matter. So I don't care as an investigator whether or not you intended to cause harm, right? At the end of the day, it is the impact of that behavior that is important. So uninvited hugs, remember our example about Stephen and the mom passing away. If we knew that physical contact with Stephen was not welcome by him, that's uninvited, that's offensive, right? Because we knew. It could be patronizing behavior, dismissive behavior, exclusionary behavior. Remember, we talked about ostracizing, ignoring people being the oldest form of social punishment there is. It might be examples of sharing jokes or emails, text messages, inappropriate images about women, about gay people, visible minorities, persons with disabilities, implying or stating that women are distracted by family. It can be any of those things. It could be calling, you know, a lesbian woman a butch. It's behavior that has moved from sort of, again, that mildly offensive level to more overtly offensive, even if it is not intentional. So at this stage of the spectrum, we are talking about behavior that needs to be corrected, right? Because we are now in the offensive category of conduct. Seriously offensive is really, again, it's a spectrum, right? So we're increasing the level of offense. So it's demeaning words or slurs that refer to somebody's sexual or gender identity, or sorry, sexual orientation or gender identity. Jokes about a person's limited intellect or skill because of their gender or sexual orientation. So you don't know as much because you're a woman, or you don't know as much because you're gay, or you don't know as much because you're trans, or you don't know as much because you're disabled. Demeaning comments about somebody's physical attributes. And so again, it is taking that spectrum and raising it to the next level of being seriously offensive. And this is disciplinary type behavior, assuming all of the components of the legal test have been satisfied, right? And then we move to evident sexual misconduct. And so this is, you know, level 5 of our spectrum. So this is, when we say evident, it's just very obvious that this is sexual harassment. So that is physical contact, right? Like grabbing at somebody's, rude patting, unwelcome holding, unwelcome kissing. I would even add leering to that, you know, that moment where, and I've investigated cases like this where the allegation is that someone would just sort of stare like this, right? Leering at them. Evident sexual misconduct. Pursuing a personal or intimate relationship with someone when they have expressed their disinterest, making jokes that demean a person or group of person, demeaning comments rather about a person's sexuality, and belittling people by saying that they use their gender or sexuality to advance career goals. These are all examples that Professor Reardon has included in her spectrum. And so we are at the 5th level of the spectrum here. It's obvious misconduct, it's evident. And here it's egregious. Like this is sort of the worst of the worst in terms of the behavior, right? So here we're talking about exposing one's bodies, pressing up against somebody suggestively, threatening or implying career damage to someone if they don't participate in sex or sexual behavior, forcing someone, so sexual assault, rape, that is at the top end of the spectrum. And again, this is meant to be a tool, right? It's meant to be a tool that helps individuals and organizations sort of categorize the level of offense. And it is not meant to say that lower level offenses are better than higher level offenses. What it does is it gives a name to the behavior, and it gives an appropriate response mechanism on the part of the employer. So I'm just going to skip through these things here. Okay, so we are now on our section that is intended to talk about preventing workplace sexual harassment. So what can you do as an employer to prevent this kind of behavior, right? Like we've talked about the prevalence, we've talked about the targets. And by the way, where we're at in terms of the program, this piece is relatively short. And then we have one final module, part 5, which is called Responding to Workplace Sexual Harassment. So this is the prevention piece, and then we're going to talk responding, and that will conclude our webinar for this morning. So we're going to kick things off with a poll. Matt, if you wouldn't mind popping that up. So we just really want to get a sense from folks in terms of whether or not you know if your workplace has a clear policy with respect to workplace sexual harassment. You can go ahead and answer that now.
We have just a few more seconds.
Fantastic. So 82% of you said yes, that you know your workplace has a clear policy with respect to workplace sexual harassment. And I am pleasantly surprised, frankly, and I think a lot of that response is generated by the folks that we have obviously on the call today and the work that you do. Because when I give this training sessions to other groups, that response is typically much lower. A lot of folks don't know if their organization has a policy that is clear with respect to workplace sexual harassment, notwithstanding the fact that the law now requires it. But I'm happy to hear that the majority of you folks do. One of the reasons it's so important when we talk about policies, you know, like it gets one of those things where, like, as lawyers, we're always talking about policies, procedures, those kinds of things, but they're so critical for people to know and understand not only what their rights are, but what the process is going to be. What can I expect if I am going to bring forward to my employer a complaint of workplace harassment? What are the steps that they must do? What information am I going to receive back? What is going to be expected of me in this process? Similarly, if somebody has made a complaint against me, what can I expect that process to look like? Where is the fairness that happens in terms of fact finding and determining results and conclusions? So publicizing and training on the policies is absolutely critical. And to highlight this, we're going to give a quick video on an interview of Anita Hill. Most of you will recognize that name. Anita Hill is an American attorney and educator who garnered national attention in her testimony in the 1991 Senate confirmation hearings for U.S. Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas, who you'll recall she accused of sexual harassment. One of the things that Professor Hill has spoken with frequency since that time is the fact that the Senate had absolutely no process in place for receiving complaints. Right. And so they were putting people on the bench, says she, who may in fact have complaints against them. The complainants were unable to come forward because there was no system to do so. And we see that in workplaces as well. There's no system for reporting and understanding. And interestingly, these criticisms were recently repeated during and following Christine Blasey Ford's allegations against Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh. But the video just kind of brings home that point of the importance of creating, publicizing, and training on policies.
So let's talk about fixes. Historically,
whenever sexual harassment comes to the fore in culture, it seems like we think about it just long enough to feel like we've addressed it, but not quite long enough to actually address it. What are the ways that we can tackle the problem of workplace harassment?
Well, one of the things that we need to do to change the culture and actually convince people, we're serious about it, is to publicize the policies.
Right. And
to inform people, this is what happens if you file a complaint. Here are the things that you will do. Here are the questions that you will face. Here is the process. I also think that there's some management things that we can do. We, for example, can do bystander training, because I think people are still, some of them are saying, well, I don't know what to do.
I think back now to myself in the workplace over the years, and I can't honestly say that I consistently spoke up if I saw creepy behavior, especially when I was much younger, and I felt that I was on the lower end of the power dynamic and didn't necessarily feel empowered to speak out and say that's wrong. That's a pretty poor excuse, but it's probably how I felt at the time. How should I feel about myself looking back other than slightly ashamed?
Slightly ashamed is a good start.
That's a very kind way to put it. What was that saying? Actual shame would be at the very least the destination you would aim for.
Well, sometimes shame is helpful.
Right.
Sometimes shaming is not helpful. It just makes people feel guilty and maybe even resentful. So you have to hit this at a moment where people feel empathetic and not just embarrassed and ashamed of themselves. If you were to go back to some of those situations, let's pick one.
Yeah.
What would you do now?
I think probably just say, that was a pretty creepy thing to do, right?
Well, that's a really sort of manly thing to do,
Right.
but might you also say to the person who is getting the brunt of this and say, how are you?
Right.
How does this feel to you? Would you like for me to say something?
Yeah. It's kind of sad that that's not instinctive reaction, isn't it?
Well, there are sadder reactions. Okay.
How optimistic can you allow yourself to be right now in terms of how things are going to change?
I'm certainly more optimistic than I was 27 years ago.
That's a low bar.
That's a very low bar. But even then, I was somewhat optimistic because I have seen people step up. I've heard from women whose lives have been changed because things happened differently when they went forward with their complaint than they would have expected it to happen years before. So I'm hopeful.
When do you think this problem will finally be fixed? Do you think it'll be wrapped up before or after the ice caps are gone? I'm just trying to work out whether a safe workplace and polar bears are mutually exclusive.
Well, the ice caps are melting pretty fast.
Okay.
And the change here seems to be glacially slow.
Right.
But I will say that if we do nothing, the change is not going to come.
Anita Hill, thanks so much for talking to us.
Thank you.
So let's talk.
Okay, so we've talked about, again, our module is about sort of preventing workplace sexual harassment. What do we need to do? We talked about the need for creating clear policies, non-binary in terms, publicizing those policies, and training our people on them. The other thing we really need is for leaders to step up their game. And I told you that during the public consultation process, what we often heard was concerns with leadership. And that's across the board, just in the sense that if a leader is either engaging or equally as damaging, condoning, meaning not properly addressing this kind of behavior in the workplace, it sends a message of acceptance. And so training and policies are critical, but they only go so far. So certainly leadership is one of the most important factors in our organizations. And so it's the fortitude to enforce those policies that really is critical. And there is all kinds of leadership training around this issue that I would encourage folks to look up. It's really important that we promote an inclusive culture with a zero tolerance policy. So you'll recall that I went through the legal test for workplace harassment with you before, and you'll also recall me emphasizing that typically harassment is a series of behavior, comments, conducts, or gestures, and that it takes a one-time event to be very significantly serious and lasting impact to meet that legal definition. As I said then, and I'll say again now, I'm not giving permission to people to engage in one acts of workplace harassment, right? Because the thing about having a zero tolerance policy makes it very clear within your organization that none of this behavior will be accepted. And enforcing that zero tolerance policy, right? So even if you see behavior that is mildly offensive on the spectrum that wouldn't otherwise meet the definition of workplace harassment because there hasn't been a series of events, it is still critical as leaders, as organizations, that we address that behavior immediately, because we know, firstly, bad behavior is contagious. We know the negative impact is not just on the target victim, but their coworkers and bystanders. And we know that if behavior happens once, it very likely will happen again. And once there is that repetition, we have a legal case of harassment, right? So it's enforcing that zero tolerance that is critical. It's modeling appropriate behavior, right? Being leadership means leading by example. It also means addressing inappropriate behavior immediately and not condoning that through inaction. In terms of prevention, it's also equally important to equip our employees, our staff, our people with things like bystander training, right? So bystander training gives people the skills to intervene when someone is harassing another person, right? What are my skills? What things can I do if I have seen this happen, right? And so it's preventing people from being a bystander and turning them into essentially what we call an upstander. Conflict management and difficult conversations training. You would be amazed, perhaps not, on the lack of tools people have to resolve low-level conflict in the workplace themselves before it escalates. We're not taught it in kindergarten. We're not taught it in school. We're not taught it in our professional academic careers. We're not taught how to resolve low-level conflict, right? We're taught to be nice or don't say anything if we don't have anything nice to say, but we're not given the tools to sort of self-mediate low-level conflict. So that's critical. And sensitivity and diversity training, right? We have our workforces are so diverse, and they will continue to be so. And so helping people understand and demonstrate sensitivity to different values, to different attitudes, to different behaviors of others is also really critical. Okay, so we are moving on to our final module of the webinar, and this is the response piece. So this is designed to give you shine a sort of a light on the tools and resources that I've mentioned before around, what tools you can have and use to respond to workplace harassment. So we're going to kick this module off also with a poll. And Matt, if you would mind putting that up there. So we have 3 questions as part of this poll. And again, because we've now talked about what workplace sexual harassment is and the prevention piece, I'd like to sort of gauge your understanding now about different hypothetical scenarios of workplace sexual harassment. So we've got 3 scenarios. The first is Tammy, Daryl rubbed my shoulders. It made me feel uncomfortable. Shane says, oh, no worries there. That's just Daryl. He means no harm. He's happily married. Is this workplace sexual harassment? The second question is Bob is pansexual. I think he just can't pick what side of the fence he's on. Ha, ha, ha. Is this workplace sexual harassment? And then finally, Sally is really good, but the guys aren't going to listen to a woman foreman. So Sam gets the job. Is that a form of workplace sexual harassment? So you can go ahead and answer those.
Give about 5 more seconds.
Thank you. Okay, and I know we have a highly intelligent group with us today, and so I'm very impressed by all of your responses. So first, 97% of you said the first scenario was a form of workplace sexual harassment. So yes, yay, you were listening, or yay, you already knew. But yeah, absolutely. Daryl's motivation is irrelevant, and as the excuse that, you know, that so-and-so is happily married and otherwise doesn't cause harm, right? So absolutely, that is the example that we gave earlier of that's just so-and-so, they don't mean any harm by it. Motive is irrelevant. It is the impact that matters. The second question, again, 100%, well done. 100% of you said that this comment with respect to Bob's sexual orientation is a form of workplace sexual harassment. And then finally, we have question 3, which is, you know, Sally not getting the job over Sam. And 93% of you said that's a form of workplace sexual harassment. Now, 7% of you said you weren't sure. Because you can't necessarily participate actively in the webinar, I'm going to guess for you that you weren't sure because perhaps, you know, there's the question as to whether or not Sam is more qualified, et cetera. Let's assume the skills are the same or comparable. But certainly the fact that, and we see this a lot in, you know, New Brunswick has a large blue collar construction based workforce. And so it is certainly not uncommon in the trades, in my experience, and in industrial settings for there to be the assumption in terms of a woman's ability, a person with disabilities, physical or mental disabilities, their ability to perform particular tasks, or folks who identify as members of the LGBTQ2S+ community. So yes, that is a form of workplace harassment on scenario 3 as well. So well done. Okay, so we talked about this a little bit before, but before we talk about, you know, how you respond, I want to explain a little bit more fully where your legal obligations to respond come from. And that legal obligation is both the prevention piece and addressing piece. So there's a prevention obligation and a response obligation. That comes firstly in part by the common law. And again, we kind of call that in the legal world judge-made law. So oftentimes that is where a judge has a particular case before them and they are making an interpretation in the absence of a written piece of legislation, or they are interpreting legislation in terms of what they believe the legislation means. And so you find those in written decisions of the courts, and the written decisions of the courts then give us sort of pieces of law that form the foundation of these legal obligations around workplace harassment. And one of them, as I told you before, is the courts have implied in every employment contract, whether that contract is in writing or it's oral, they've implied this condition that says the employer will provide a safe and harassment-free work environment. And so if an employer does not provide those circumstances, an employee can argue that the employer has breached their employment contract, which can then lead to a civil lawsuit. So we have that arm of law. We also have the Occupational Health and Safety Act, which, as I told you before, was amended in 2019 to require all New Brunswick employers who are provincially regulated to have a policy with respect to workplace harassment in all of its forms and to train its employees on that policy. And there's some prevention steps in the legislation and the regulation as well. And we have human rights legislation, which, as we know, also prohibits harassment and discrimination on the basis of a number of protected grounds, but for our purposes here today, that includes sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. So that's where it all comes from. In terms of consequences, so for an employee who is harassing another, that employee can be disciplined up to and including termination by their employer. And that in part is helpful where the spectrum comes into play in terms of helping you as employers determine how severe the conduct was and what the appropriate response might be. Employees can be held personally, financially liable under health and safety legislation, human rights legislation. So that employee can possibly be required to pay out of pocket for their inappropriate behavior. And depending on the conduct, there's also the possibility of being charged with a criminal offense under the Criminal Code of Canada. And so there we're talking about egregious sexual behavior, including sexual assault. Importantly, as is the case with all laws, ignorance of the law is not an excuse for an employee. So their motive is irrelevant, and their understanding of what the law requires of them is equally irrelevant in determining what an employee's obligations are. In terms of employer consequences, employers are statutorily, meaning in the legislation, required to prevent and address workplace harassment, and that's under the Occupational Health and Safety Act and human rights legislation. And if not, the employer can be held financially responsible for that failure. In addition, employers are responsible for the actions of their employees, and we call that vicarious liability in the law. But essentially, a lack of awareness by management doesn't necessarily eliminate this liability. So because you didn't know it was happening doesn't necessarily provide you with a defense, right? If you knew or reasonably ought to have known, then you will be responsible for the conduct of your employees. So due diligence is certainly required. So what does due diligence look like for employers? Well, we talked about the amendments under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and that firstly kicked off, at least provincially in New Brunswick, this requirement to have the workplace policy that we've been talking about. Now, what the Occupational Health and Safety Act essentially says, and it's actually regulations under the Act, but for clarity purposes, I'll just refer to it as a legislation. But essentially, the policy that you have within your workplace must have an investigation procedure. How are you going to investigate complaints of workplace harassment? The policy must have information concerning how infected employees will be informed of the results. So there's a communication piece there. How are you going to advise the employees of, and when I say employees, the complainant and the respondent, this is not a public process, about the results of an investigation or inquiry. It has to have procedures to implement any corrective measures post-investigation if necessary. Any follow-up measures with employees. It has to identify training needs. It has to have a statement that every employee is entitled to work free of harassment. It has to identify who's responsible for doing what under the policy. And it also requires employees to immediately report incidents of harassment to the employer. So that's what the law says that you must have in your policy, okay? And as I said before, the template policy, I believe I was calling it a draft before, but it's actually a template policy under the Safer Places NB website, has all of those components. So if you don't already have a policy, you can use that, or you can review it to see whether or not yours requires modification. As I recall at the beginning of our webinar, most of you said that you have a workplace policy that is clear. And so that might be not as useful as a tool for you, but we certainly have other tools that may be. So that's what the law says the policy must have. This is what we say are critical pieces for an effective policy. And so again, clear language and description of processes is important so people understand the process. So it's not built in a whole bunch of legalese that folks have difficulty interpreting. It has to talk about, to be effective, confidentiality and its limits. So workplace investigations are highly confidential. And so the policy really has to address the confidentiality piece and what the obligations of the complainant, the person complaining, is, the respondent, the person against the complaint, against whom the complaint has been lodged, what their confidentiality obligations are, as also for witnesses. It should have an informal and formal resolution process. So here's the thing. What we also heard during the public consultation process, and what I know about the conflict resolution work my company does, is that oftentimes people do not want to be embroiled in a complex, lengthy workplace investigation. Okay, sometimes that's absolutely necessary. Oftentimes people just want the behavior to stop. right? They just want the other person to acknowledge that that conduct, comment, or gesture was inappropriate, perhaps apologize, perhaps receive training. But to do that properly, we have to, within our policies, have an informal resolution process that can be used when appropriate. It won't always be appropriate, but it should be there. And it should explain what the options are. And then the formal resolution process is the investigatory procedure that the law says you must have, right? Highly recommend gender neutral language. So they, them, as opposed to he, she, or him, her. Again, from that inclusivity perspective, it's critically important. And also the policy, it's really helpful if it has an explanation of the different types of harassment with examples. And again, the template policy on the website has this because there are different forms of harassment, and understanding those different forms is important, especially if you are a person that's questioning whether or not you've been the target of that kind of behavior. So the other critical pieces for an effective policy is that it should be regularly reviewed. This cannot be a static document that is just kind of thrown on the shelf and forgotten about, because as you work through the policy on individual cases or complaints, you will see where the strengths are and potentially where some of the weaknesses are of your policies. And so they should be reviewed regularly. Reviews should be done in consultation with the Joint Health and Safety Committee, if you have one. Or with the employees if you don't have a committee under the legislation. You have to provide training to all employees. That's actually statutorily required. And you also have to keep training records to be made available in the event a WorkSafe NB officer requests those. And so there is certainly a legislation-based requirement to provide the training, keep the records for compliance purposes. There's some other critical kind of approaches to workplace sexual harassment, which in large part came out of the public consultation piece that we did. And so to respect the person who is the target of this behavior and to ensure that there is a proper procedural protocol. One of the things that is really important is respecting the autonomy of the person affected. And so what that means is giving that person some say, some power in how the matter will be addressed or resolved, okay? Because often what we heard is that individuals will make a complaint to their employer, then they have no say what happens next. They just sort of get sucked into this vortex of either no communication or a full-blown investigation when they really just wanted the behavior to stop. So whenever possible, sometimes you'll get complainants that don't want to make a formal complaint, that don't want you to do anything about it. You can't really, if you know that behavior is happening, it has to be addressed. So when I say autonomy of the person affected, I mean to the largest extent possible in the circumstances, giving that person some power and some say over the processes that will be undertaken. Confidentiality is critical. In that no one should be aware that a complaint has filed other than the person responsible for processing that complaint, the complainant, and the respondent. And so workplace investigations and complaints are highly confidential. They must be treated as such. They're not always treated as such. And unfortunately, what happens is the names and reputations of people get sort of slated or tarnished even before there's been a formal investigation or inquiry into complaints. We also have sort of tainting of evidence. So if there has been an incident and I'm doing an investigation, for example, and I'm talking to a witness and that witness goes and tells everybody else the questions that I asked, you know, when people talk about events and memories and occasions, then often their recollection can be impacted, and it's often very unintentional, right? But think of those circumstances where you talk about an event with someone who recalls it differently than you do, and sometimes that can shape your recollection, right? And so to preserve the integrity of the evidence, confidentiality is important. To preserve rather the reputation of the parties, confidentiality is important. And to preserve dignity and respect, confidentiality is very much important. And communication is also really important in terms of making sure that we have that loop back to the complainant and the respondents. They need to know what's happening at all times. And so in terms of the policy, as I said before, on the Safer Places NB website, you will find a template harassment policy. There are some important definitions there on the different types of workplace harassment. There's also a schedule that's attached to the template that gives you examples of the different forms of workplace harassment. So it gives you various examples of psychological harassment, of sexual harassment, of poisonous work environment, of abuse of authority. You will also find on the website a very handy document called a checklist and response guidelines for employers. And what that does is give employers exactly what it is, what the name insinuates. It's a checklist in terms of what to do as an employer if you receive information or complaint about workplace harassment, all forms. And then it gives you a step-by-step process in terms of how to process that information or complaint. Okay, so it's a very handy tool. It also has built within it that spectrum of sexual misconduct that we talked about earlier. So as employers, for those of you that are responsible for the people on the line, the policy in that document, the checklist and response guidelines are really critical. And even if you have those things within your organization, still worth a look, because there's always, again, we can always improve our own policies. There's also a printable complaint form on the website. If your organization does not have an internal complaint form, lots of places don't, so this just gives folks access to that. What is also on the website that I'll just talk about really quickly is you'll recall that there are the handout on preventing and responding to microaggressions. There are also several handouts for bystanders and for individuals who are experiencing workplace sexual harassment, so what to do, how to respond to those things. You'll recall that there is a handout on various terms and definitions relating to the LGBTQ2S+ community. And there's various other documents on there. So I certainly invite you to take a look, peruse the resource page, and use any of those documents as you see fit. So finally, just in terms of additional resources, I just wanted to give you a few spots to find other information if you don't otherwise have it. So the Safer Places NB I've talked about at length. PLEIS NB has various resources on its website as well around education on this topic. The New Brunswick Human Rights Commission also has information and actually has guidelines on workplace sexual harassment. And of course, we have WorkSafe NB, who also has some guidelines and information around this workplace issue.